Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next recording session as part of our workshop series for the Climate Resilience Roadmap for Ontario Municipal Infrastructure Systems. It was developed by the Regional Public Works Commissioners of Ontario, or RPWCO. My name is Shelley Hazen, and I'm a climate change specialist with Savanta GEI, and today I'm joined by Glenn Milner from the Climate Risk Institute. We're also joined today by RPWCO Climate Change Subcommittee members from the City of Thunder Bay, Windsor, Ottawa, and the region of Durham. We'd also like to thank Rambo Consulting for their contributions to the development of the roadmap. This is our second training session on setting up an adaptation or risk-related project, engaging stakeholders, and undertaking a municipal asset inventory. If you haven't already done so and would like to obtain an overview of the entire process of the RPWCO roadmap, we recommend that you go back and listen to training session number 1, which provides an introduction to the roadmap and summarizes each step of the process. So today's session aligns with steps 1 and 2 of the roadmap, as you'll see highlighted on this slide. 1 is engagement and setup, and 2 is asset inventory. The first step in the roadmap is about engaging and setting up your project. So this figure provides a high-level summary of the sub-steps that will support you in completing this step, including establishing guiding principles, creating your project team and advisors, assessing your adaptation maturity, and identifying your stakeholders. And we're going to be walking through these sub-steps in more details in our session today. So before we get into the details, let's go over what you'll learn to do and be provided support on in step 1. So the guidance document highlights best practices and tips throughout the roadmap to support you along every step of the way. So in step 1, the roadmap guidance document highlights the importance of checking in across your departments, and that's public works, transportation, public health, and land use planning as an example, to avoid duplication of efforts on climate adaptation. So you want to make sure that you're working together and not in silos on climate adaptation efforts. So the guide highlights the importance of also creating a diverse, cross-departmental infrastructure-focused core team. It's also important to clearly identify roles and responsibilities in the terms of reference for your team members, your advisory committee, and your stakeholders. And this is in order to ensure that everyone is clear on matters such as when and how often everyone should be meeting and what's actually expected of them. Step 1A is about establishing guiding principles. So prior to beginning the adaptation process, it's really important that you develop and adopt guiding principles for assessing and planning for the effects of climate change. So these principles can be used to demonstrate alignment and consistency, and they should align with those that are already in place within a municipality as part of your planning efforts. So as noted in training session 1, Appendix 1 of the roadmap contains 17 valuable activities that build off of the guidance provided in this document and demonstrate how to complete the steps along the roadmap. So activity 1 is going to provide you with a checklist of guiding principles that have been most commonly applied by Ontario municipalities in the past in support of their climate processes. So it's recommended that each municipality review this list and identify those that are most appropriate for them. For example, priorities that are evidence-based, have strong alignment, are flexible, transparent, and that are partnership-driven, just to name a few. So you should document the guiding principles that will be used and presented to senior decision makers and council in your future climate adaptation efforts. The next sub-step is creating your team and advisory committee. So ideally, a core project team should be created with municipal staff who are infrastructure focused and are able to move the roadmap forward. So the roadmap actually recommends that you avoid just having one person on your team. You want to make sure that they aren't overloaded with a workload or working in a silo, because that's likely going to pose challenges in implementation. So in other words, you should be aiming to involve infrastructure-focused staff, but also broaden out your team as much as possible across across other departments. So in some instances, it might even be appropriate to have representation from finance staff involved to help build alignment and buy-in from staff who are charged with prioritizing funding amongst numerous competing priorities. So there are some questions that your municipality is probably going to need to ask to help you guide through this step and make sure that you're choosing the right people to be a part of your project team. These questions are: who has interest and capacity to participate? Do you have diverse representation across your municipality? Have you included and linked planning and public works on your team? Have you created a terms of reference to guide your team and advisors? Are there existing committees or groups that you can leverage to support you in your efforts? Does your team include representation from operations and maintenance? And finally, would it be helpful to have staff from finance to build buy-in at your municipality? You can also refer to Activity 2 in the roadmap, which provides a process to help you identify important municipal staff across various departments as part of building a project team and advisory committee. So what would your ideal project team actually look like? Who should be included? Well, as we touched upon in the last slide a little bit, it's really important to select staff with dedicated time and resources. So those that actually have the capacity to support your projects and your work. Your team should have clearly defined roles and responsibilities that are established up front, and therefore any work that is underway, everyone knows what they're responsible for, what they're doing, and when. So this might be approximately 2 to 5 key team members who have the ability to bring in input from other staff to the table. But ultimately, your team size is largely going to depend on the resources that you have available to you within your municipality. So it's going to range from municipality to municipality. Once your team is in place, it's a valuable exercise to begin thinking of the scope of your adaptation efforts as a municipality. So this lays the groundwork for assessing what steps you may have already completed and what steps you might still need to undertake. And this is known as identifying your adaptation maturity. And this refers to a municipality's institutional readiness and progress in adapting to climate change for infrastructure and systems. So the maturity scale developed by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities was actually used to inform this sub-step of the roadmap and the activities that support its completion. This step also helps a municipality identify how the roadmap is most valued to them, as it guides you to key resources based on your maturity, based on where you're actually at as a municipality as a whole. So Activity 3 in the roadmap prompts you to consider the components of each step along the roadmap and whether your municipality has already made progress in a particular area. So it identifies where you might be able to potentially skip ahead in the roadmap, in particular for municipalities that are more advanced or at a higher advanced stage along their adaptation efforts. In terms of assessing your adaptation readiness, undertaking a robust climate adaptation process, it looks different for each municipality, and this is expected. So as mentioned, the roadmap contains an activity that can help you evaluate your progress against each step. So for steps that you may have not yet completed and deemed helpful for municipality, the roadmap will then provide you guidance on how to complete those steps. So on this side, you'll see an example of part of the maturity activity. And you'll notice that in this activity, for each of the actions, you can select yes, in process, no, or not needed. So depending on how advanced your municipality is, you might not need to actually undertake each of these activities. And additional guidance on how to fill out this activity is provided for you in Appendix 1. As a complementary resource, if you'd like further guidance on where your municipality as a whole is at along the adaptation process to supporting your scoping efforts, we recommend that you review the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Maturity Scale. And supporting resources are peppered throughout the roadmap along each step. So we really encourage municipalities to explore all of this content to support them in their efforts. The final sub-step in step 1 that will help users with engagement and project setup is guidance that's provided to you to identify and characterize relevant stakeholders. So you should consider how, when, and to what extent engagement actually needs to factor into your adaptation process. It's really critical that external stakeholders, partners, and councils understand and buy into the results from this process to ultimately invest and build resilience within your municipality down the road. So the matrix that you're seeing on this slide illustrates different types of municipal stakeholders, which are important to consider at the beginning of your adaptation process. So it's important to keep in mind that a particular stakeholder or a person's position within this matrix can actually change over time. And it's also expected that stakeholders that comprise a particular category are probably going to differ depending on the municipality that they're in. So to support you in this process, it's recommended that you begin by reviewing a list of stakeholders identified by RPWCO municipalities and reach a consensus on what potential categories they may fall into and when to engage them. So all of this information can be found in Activity 4 of the roadmap. So let's review these categories in a little bit more detail. So Category 1 in green. These are known as the must-haves. So these stakeholders have high influence and high interest, and they lend themselves to close collaboration throughout the roadmap process and in workshops. So for example, this could be lower or upper tier municipalities or perhaps conservation authorities. So these stakeholders should be engaged early on in the beginning of the roadmap process to support in your scoping and throughout the project. Category 2 is shown in gray, and these are known as the optionals. So these are stakeholders with low influence but high interest. They should be engaged and invited to participate in external workshop sessions and support in integrating community interests into infrastructure analyses. But they don't necessarily need to be involved intimately early on in your process. An example of this type of stakeholder might be academics in your area, for example. Category 3 is shown in orange, and these are known as the recognized. So these are stakeholders with low interest and low influence, but they should be recognized and receive occasional updates on roadmap progress as appropriate. But they don't need to be as intimately involved. This could be, for example, neighboring jurisdictions or broader associations like Asset Management Ontario, for example. And lastly, Category 4 shown in blue, these are known as the influencers. So these are stakeholders that have high influence but low interest or capacity to actually participate. A great example of this is higher orders of government. So the roadmap proposes that they should be made aware of the roadmap process and receive communication as to what it is and how the results might fit in with their mandate, and potentially attend engagement sessions as deemed appropriate by your municipality. So the level of engagement that's most appropriate will really depend on your individual municipality. Some of you may choose to invest in significant and ongoing engagement as part of your sustainability or climate change services and efforts, where others may not be able to commit to such efforts beyond critical participation or validation from experts. Just as types of stakeholders differ between municipalities, so too can the timing of when they should be engaged throughout the adaptation process. So the following example illustrates a proposed typical timing of when to engage stakeholders based on the categories that we just walked through in the last slide. And again, you'll find this table in Activity 4 in the roadmap. So it's encouraged that you review the following matrix displaying when to engage each type or category of stakeholder. When completing the roadmap, a municipality can then use this table, cross-reference it with stakeholders that have been identified already, and confirm the specific stakeholders that you hope to engage at each step along the process. Timing and engagement is one example of how you can consider different types of stakeholders, but keep in mind that this really depends on your individual municipality and their level of appetite for engagement. So you'll notice at the end of this process in the final step, you'll want to have all stakeholders engaged and reconvened. You may remember from the first training overview session that we introduced how case studies and real-world examples are peppered throughout the guide on each step of the roadmap. So climate change is a very broad category, and therefore you need to engage a variety or a wide variety of experts, stakeholders, and knowledge holders in order to have effective planning and implementation. So here's an example of a case study that's provided on page 11 of the roadmap. Through an initiative called Earth Care, the City of Thunder Bay partners with community on key sustainability and adaptation topics on an ongoing basis. So the backbone of this initiative are Earth Care working groups. And these working groups consist of city employees, community stakeholders, academics, and interested citizens. So each one of these groups focuses on one of 11 sustainability themes found in the City of Thunder Bay Sustainability Plan. And they range from water to waste, active transportation to climate adaptation. So the Earth Care Climate Adaptation Working Group provides an ongoing and open opportunity for engagement with citizens and stakeholders to be involved, engaged with, and contribute to adaptation actions that are actually ongoing in the community. So during the creation of the Thunder Bay Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, the Climate Adaptation Working Group provided a strong foundation network for engagement, and this process grew to having over 170 contributors. You can find more details on this initiative in the guide, along with additional case studies. I'm now going to pass it over to Glenn to walk you through our second step of the roadmap.
Thanks, Shelley. Quick audio check. Are you able to hear me?
All good. Yes.
So moving from step 1 into step 2 of the RPWCO roadmap is a critical point before you jump into a vulnerability or a risk assessment in much more detail. And that is because it's all about taking stock of the data you have available to you and undertaking a bit of a municipal asset inventory prior to diving deep. And the reason being is that we must have sufficient data or detailed data rather, to enable us to make informed, robust, risk-based decisions. And so step 2 of the roadmap really go into a lot more detail around obtaining and evaluating GIS data that may be already available, refining or scoping the actual assets and the themes for risk assessments that you may want to undertake in your each individual jurisdiction, and ultimately aligning those themes with relevant legislation, such as OREG 588, which I'll mention further on the next slide. The next one. So roadmap step 2 has a series of components to it, and really what you'll learn in this section is all around data. So the first being the importance of digitized or geospatial data to inform risk assessments. So ideally for as many municipal assets as possible, it's important to have digitized GIS information already in a centralized format. So as part of step 2 of this roadmap process, it's critical that you engage the staff who work in a GIS department if you have one at your municipality, or among some of the folks in asset management who may be working with data on a regular basis. And also critically to include non-municipal data sets that may also be important, like external data sets around hospitals, utilities, and we'll come back to that. The other thing you'll learn in this section of the roadmap is how to align potential themes of a risk assessment with services your municipality provides, and to identify complementary or additional themes that may not be corporately responsible from a particular municipality, but that are important to capture. Things like potentially cultural heritage buildings, energy systems, depending on your individual context. And ultimately consider how critical assets influence that process. And so the endpoint of step 2 of the RPWCO roadmap is to enable you to conduct that inventory table, which will enable you to decide what assets and what systems are actually going to be taken forward and carried through a more detailed risk assessment. And as Shelley mentioned earlier, Appendix 1 has an activity that will help you through all of these steps in step 2, which is activity number 5, which will help kind of guide the logic and the decision points and help populate an actual inventory table. Next slide. So just beginning with the very first sub-step of step 2, which is thinking about the municipal services that are already being provided. A lot of the exercises in this step of the roadmap are not complex, but they're helped to kind of tailor and guide the logic behind establishing and scoping the types of risk assessments that are most valuable to your individual context. We often hear from municipalities as they approach adaptation and risk assessments that it's quite complex. They don't know how to narrow down the list of the different themes they could bring to council or to the senior decision makers to undertake in more detail. And so this is a process that will help you with that, to refine it based on your individual needs. And so what we recommend is to start with these two key questions. Number one, what services does your municipality provide? And number two, what are the natural and built assets required to deliver those services? And we have deliberately included the word natural asset as well in that question on purpose, to incorporate important critical assets around the ecosystems. And once you've really done this exercise and walked through activity number 5, think about how these are actually defined in relevant policy or legislation. So things like Ontario Regulation 577 around asset management. And really just create a list and help align your thinking around what might be most poignant or what might resonate to senior decision makers, and move on from there. So next slide. And from there, it's important to think about what do you already understand around the levels of service that are being provided by your municipality. So I wanted to pause and caveat that the roadmap itself does not help define your level of service under current or future resilient considerations. However, it helps build that foundational piece that can then be used to have those conversations once you've actually provided some outputs out of this process. So it will prompt you to think about what are the existing levels of service for the services documented and what sorts of components affect those. So things like legislation, community expectations, which will differ by municipality, resource constraints, of course, and relevant local municipal policies. So this is where level of service is really described in the RPWCO roadmap. So if you are interested in diving deep or looking into this more further, I would recommend jumping into step 2 specifically and looking at some relevant resources that are linked in the actual guidance document. Next slide. And this is one such case study that's provided as well. And Shelley already outlined how these case studies are peppered throughout the guidebook to enable some examples of this in action. And this is actually based in the United States in a location called Buzzard Point, which is an urban development site just located outside of Washington, D.C. And this site is in the floodplain and historically designed for a minimum flood protection level. And so this is an example of how they looked at how climate change can be incorporated to redefine levels of service to be more future-proof or more resilient. And so the city at the time wanted to understand what are some of the necessary measures to heighten our level of service in relation to storm surge, but also future flood risk. And so ultimately what they undertook was a series of cost-benefit analyses to inform more feasible levels of service for the new development going into this area. And there are several cities and municipalities that have already done this and have redefined levels of service into the future that are pointed to in the guide, and we can speak about further. Next slide. So before you proceed in terms of documenting and creating a fulsome inventory of all your assets, we wanted to recommend to consider the critical ones that have already been defined or the need to define critical assets. So before you proceed, ask yourself the question flagged on this slide, which is, do you know what critical assets your municipality has or is responsible for? And this really can depend on your individual context, but there are a lot of resources that can point you to how to develop this. So for example, Public Safety Canada's resources, FCM's resources, as well as some of the resources through Emergency Management Ontario. But this slide shows some of the different types of systems or sectors that are typically flagged in critical infrastructure discussions and exercises. So things like bridges, if there's an airport within the jurisdiction of your municipality, critical water or waste services that may exist, hospitals. And some municipalities can take this much further and go down into actual natural assets that they deem to be critical, such as heritage buildings or protected areas, all the way down to financial institutions if they deem appropriate. But it's important, I think, as part of this step of the roadmap, to just pause, reflect, and have that conversation with emergency management staff, with the asset management folks, with those who understand the municipality and actually can have a fulsome conversation around what might we deem to be critical and what are some of the resources to inform at this juncture of the RPWCO roadmap to narrow that scope. because otherwise it can be a very, very large risk assessment across all infrastructure components across a municipality, which can be quite an undertaking. Next slide. And so ultimately, what step 2 of this roadmap ultimately tells you to do is populate a bit of a template. And this is a visual representation of the template in activity number 5. But essentially, it prompts you to think about and document each one of these categories. So moving from left to right, the first being, what are the services your municipality provides? Second, what are the assets required to deliver those services? Document them in a list. The third one, what are the data sources of each one of those assets? This may seem like a relatively simplistic exercise, but time and time again, as risk assessments are scoped, a table like this is incredibly helpful to bring to a conversation, to a workshop, to enable some key decision points. So the third category, returning to that, does GIS data exist, and how confident are you in it? And we'll return to that on the next slide. Documenting those sources of information. Is it in a GIS inventory, and who has access to that inventory? The fourth category, what is its existing status? Has it been defined to be critical, or has it been previously assessed in greater detail? You'll often find in municipalities that certain assets or certain areas have received more detailed analyses than others. So document that in that fourth category to be transparent and to take more of a holistic approach. And finally, make a decision. And this is going to be where it's important to return to that step 1 of the RPWCO roadmap and engage the appropriate project team members, your advisory team, and relevant decision makers, potentially even stakeholders that you deem to be important in your community, to scope what you want to actually carry forward for your risk assessment process. And this will ultimately help you move from multiple risk assessment themes, several infrastructure systems, into quite a scoped exercise to enable the identification of high-risk areas and priorities across systems. And we'll talk more about that in the coming training sessions around this roadmap. So next slide. And so I wanted to pause and speak specifically to how we can think about evaluating digitized information for risk assessments. And it's quite important to recognize that if you want to be able to make geospatial decisions, you will need to have GIS information for the assets you hope to analyze. And so this is why in the roadmap, we distinguish between an accelerated approach versus a more detailed approach. An accelerated approach would be if you have a good amount of data already available to you, and you can kind of speed through step 2 and leverage it. It will require more effort if you have to undertake a digitization exercise through your staff or through additional efforts. And that is more of a detailed approach to enable more of a robust risk assessment later on. But this table on this slide shows a bit of a framework for decisions around the data sets you flag. So once you create that inventory table, it will prompt you to think about what is the level of completeness of a particular data set and what is your level of confidence in that particular data set. So if we take an example of municipal buildings, probably one of the easiest data sets you can think about from a GIS perspective, chances are you have it in a relatively good shape. So perhaps 90% or more of the buildings are digitized in an easy to access GIS format. And perhaps you speak to your GIS staff and they deem that data set to be mostly accurate spatially. You may find other data sets to be between 50 to 90% complete in terms of being digitized, or people deem their accuracy to be somewhat accurate. So they wouldn't put it in that high category, but they might put it more in a moderate level. And then unfortunately, you will find several data sets often in the low category, which means that they either have less than 50% of their data digitized, or it needs further validation prior to being used confidently. And so we just wanted to recommend this tiered approach as a red, yellow, green light analysis in terms of what you can carry forward. And ideally, you want to use as many high confident, high complete data sets as possible, and perhaps 1 or 2 moderate, but be very cautious using those low rated data sets to move forward and expect mapping outputs, because that is where you'll see people spin wheels and it can take a lot of effort to really get out of that scenario. So next slide. And so with that, just one additional case study that's provided on page 23 of the RPWCO roadmap is an example out of the region of Durham. And they are developing and have developed an inventory of sensitive receptors. And very similar to the logic we just presented, this is being done in support of a flood risk assessment. And they're using these sensitive receptors to deem or to define what roads are critical in the context of floodplain, access, or egress. And so the region has defined these things such as schools, hospitals, emergency services, and so on. And they're actually using these to assess them under current and future flood risk conditions. And ultimately, these sensitive receptors will help inform priorities in a relatively efficient way instead of undertaking a much more developed or detailed approach, rather, as you proceed with a risk assessment. So thinking about some of these inventories up front that can enable you to make these really important decisions later on is a helpful exercise as part of the scoping. Next slide. And with that, I'll pass it over to Shelley to provide a conceptual case example.
Thanks, Glenn. So to test drive key steps of the RPWCO roadmap, a flooding scenario was identified to enable the theory behind the roadmap to be visualized for illustrative purposes in more of a practical sense. So as a result, the neighborhood level risk assessment that was recently completed in the city of Windsor was identified to meet this need and to demonstrate how the roadmap can add value when considering spatial priorities and when considering priority setting to inform master planning initiatives. It's important to note here that this case study was completed without stakeholder engagement and should not be considered representative of actual risk in the city of Windsor. It's for illustrative purposes only. So this case study was based off of climate projections and high water level modeling that was produced through the East Riverside Flood Assessment. This information was then used to illustrate how the roadmap can be used to assess hazard priorities across assets or geographic neighborhoods. So in this image, you'll see that a series of key assets were identified and considered to be in scope of the case study. They're numbered and highlighted in the red circles on the map. So to further narrow and scope the illustrative flooding scenario case study, we began by taking stock of available information and completing a rapid inventory of assets of interest to analyze. This table was then completed to show an example of how you can visualize the level of GIS data needed for such a case study as the Windsor one that we're showing you. So you'll recall from step 2, which Glenn just walked through, data completeness and confidence can be assessed using a rating system, and you'll see that highlighted in the colors throughout this table on the slide. So activity 5 of Appendix 1 was completed as a theoretical example to illustrate how its logic can enable decision points around what assets can be considered in scope compared to those whose data might not be sufficient or digitized to be included in this assessment. So notably, again, the project team did not engage municipal staff to confirm these decisions, and that was due to various time constraints, but we interpreted these results based on past municipal experiences. And you'll actually learn how climate data and projections were applied to this specific case study in our next training session when we walk through step 3 of the roadmap. So you'll find more details on this illustrative case study in Appendix 2 of the roadmap, and we'll be carrying this example through our next training sessions over the subsequent steps that we're going to be discussing and recording for this roadmap process. So that concludes our summary of steps 1 and 2 of the roadmap, and we'd now like to open it up for questions from the attending RPWCO subcommittee members.
Hi, it's Jacob Porter, Climate Adaptation Coordinator for the City of Thunder Bay. In step 1, the roadmap talks about building our team and engaging with stakeholders. Are there examples of unconventional stakeholders that might be beneficial for municipalities to engage to help push forward our work and agendas?
Thanks, Jake. That's a great question. So thinking outside of the box in terms of who to engage can be a really great way to bring unconventional stakeholders on board who might be able to support your agendas. So if you're able to identify, for example, what's known as champions in other organizations or within the public that have the ability to sort of broaden your reach, broaden your audience, or share your message, this might actually assist you in gaining support and ultimately at the end of the day buy-in, which is what we're looking for to help push our efforts forward. So for example, this might include local schools or academics in the area, community clubs or groups, or even citizen science groups if those exist within your municipality. So perhaps it's an organization or group that you might not have worked with in the past, but has a mandate that aligns with your municipality's vision that can support your guiding principles that you're going to be establishing in step one. So taking the time to research these types of unconventional stakeholders that you can engage with is recommended for everyone and can probably help further your agenda and just help push along these adaptation efforts in your community. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, yes, it's Karina from the city of Windsor. And I have a question about, although this guide does not specifically assist in helping municipalities define their level of service, are there examples of cities that have already done so that we can look at to support us in this step?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as Glenn mentioned, the roadmap does not specifically help you define your level of service, but if you go through step 2, it does provide additional guidance and details on where you can find support to do this within your municipality. So there's actually quite a few examples of cities that have already defined levels of service, in particular as it relates to pluvial flooding. So for example, these include cities like London, which has defined their level of service for a 30-year event, Chicago for a 5-year event, Rotterdam for a 2-year event, and New York City for a 5-year event. So these examples are actually highlighted in the guide, along with suggested additional reading materials and resources. So we've highlighted them and encourage readers to then go and look at those reports and see how they've defined their level of service, why they chose that level of service, and how it aligns with those flooding events that they are actually planning and designing for. So by reading your case studies of how others have actually defined level of service, it's a really great way to help you sort of inspire and guide your municipality through this process. And it really does depend on your individual municipality, but it is nice to know what others have done in this stage of their planning with LOS. Thanks, Karina. Next question.
Hi, I'm Manny Rajendran, Project Manager with the Transportation Design Division of Works Department from the region of Durham. My question is, if our region or municipality hasn't defined our critical infrastructure yet, can the roadmap help us with that aspect?
Yeah, that's a great question, Manny. So the roadmap provides additional guidance to both those who have and have not previously defined critical assets and critical infrastructure. And that is one of the distinguishing features of a more accelerated approach versus more of a detailed approach where you might have to pause and go through an exercise among more fulsome engagement to define that critical infrastructure. If you have not defined that critical infrastructure, the roadmap recommends you actually convene with your emergency management staff, public works staff, other municipal departments that you deem to be relevant to really describe and discuss what assets you think could be critical or should be elevated as part of a risk assessment. And that really is the goal as part of this roadmap is documenting what are the critical infrastructure pieces that should be within scope that you don't want to lose sight of. And those may not be municipally owned. So it could be, for example, a hospital that may not be corporate responsibility, but of course you rely on that hospital that you deem it to be critical. And so the roadmap actually provides links to additional resources to undertake more of a process around definitions, such as Public Safety Canada, Emergency Management Ontario, and a few other examples in the guide. So it kind of sets you up to have that process if you need to. Otherwise, it helps you kind of document what's critical already and move forward as part of your scoping process. So great question.
Thank you.
So next question. Any other questions?
Hi, yes. My name is Hiran Sandanaik. I'm a water resources engineer in the asset management group in the city of Ottawa. In Ottawa, we have a lot of data on our municipal asset inventory, and that data comes in various formats. I'm wondering, for these steps in the roadmap, can you speak a little bit more to how critical it may be to have my asset data in GIS?
Yeah, that's a really important point and good question. I would say that, and having witnessed and lived several risk assessments across many municipalities in Ontario, it is very, very valuable to have the GIS data if one of the outputs of a risk assessment you really want is mapping. So if you're hoping to have geospatial outputs and maps for council to convey to engagement sessions to potentially residents, if it's not too sensitive or confidential, or other types of outputs like that, I would say GIS is very, very helpful. especially if some of the data is in old kind of filing cabinets or in old software that needs to be mined for particular attributes. We've also seen older software and kind of, techniques to document some of the asset information. It needs to be kind of mined for risk assessments anyway around stormwater infrastructure, for instance. So I think it is a very valuable exercise to put it into GIS, especially though if you're hoping to get a mapping output product, which I think can convey a very powerful image.
Okay, thank you.
Great question.
Great, thanks everyone. Well, I think that wraps up our training session on steps 1 and 2 of the roadmap. Our next training session is going to cover step 3, which is climate scenario analysis. So thanks for attending everyone, and we hope that you found this training session informative and helpful.